Welcome to Bat Therapy, mental health through the lens of comics and film. Be a fly on the wall or a bat in the cave, listening in on a friendship built out of a love for talking Batman, comics, and the everyday struggle to achieve mental health and happiness.
We're your hosts, clinical psychologist Dr. Amelia Brown and educator and comic aficionado Keaton Hopkins. Don't forget to follow us on YouTube and social media and find our Patreon at patreon.com/battherapy.
This podcast is about providing education and understanding and is not a replacement for mental health treatment or support. If you're needing help, go to bat-therapy.com for resources. All right, so we have our psychology spotlight this week. And so last week we talked about, I forget what the episode was called, but we talked about, finally we talked supernatural and we did the Halloween episode. And so one of the things we talked about was Dean Winchester. He's come back from hell and he's re-experiencing it. He's trying to drown it out with drinking, and you're starting to see it in the episode we were talking about. And so I thought it would be cool for us to talk about, okay, so let's say in the last episode we talked about acute stress disorder versus is it there long enough where it might actually turn into PTSD. Let's say the symptoms stick around, which I think in the show it's probably does, like longer than those 4 weeks. Let's say he actually goes and tries to figure out some PTSD treatment. And so let's walk through what Dean Winchester's options would be and what that might look like for him. Thought he could be a fun example to talk about some PTSD stuff more in detail.
Okay.
Let's do this thing. So just a friendly refresher for you, Keaton, and then for anyone, I guess, who skipped last week's episode. First off, how dare you if you did not listen last time? But
I was there.
You were there, but you probably need a refresher anyway. So when it comes to PTSD, you have some sort of traumatic event that essentially your safety has been affected in some way, or the safety of someone that you know or you witnessed. And so for Dean, obviously this is literally he went through hell. So he goes to hell, he comes back, and arguably, or maybe not even argue, he's been through many repeated traumas. But hell definitely stands out for him. And so when it comes to PTSD, there are a lot of ways that the brain and the body might react to trauma. So all of us have some sort of response and reaction that you're having to work through. When we're talking about mental health symptoms that happen because of the trauma, that's when there's some sort of difficulty with being able to process through it, getting to the other side, and it's causing some sort of problem. And so specifically with PTSD, we're talking about there's reliving or re-experiencing of the trauma in some way. So for example, like nightmares, or you might have triggers that happen. So Dean, in the episode, he sees a mask and it triggers memories of being in hell. A person can have flashbacks where they're literally re-experiencing and reliving the trauma, like it's actually playing out for them. You have re-experiencing it. You have avoidance. So with Dean, he doesn't talk to his brother about a lot of stuff. Literally, other people have to force him to talk about it. He also avoids a lot by drinking alcohol and trying to blur things out. You also might see folks going certain places, watching certain things on TV or movies, those types of things. You'll have changes in how a person thinks and feels just about life and experiences because of the trauma in extreme ways, where for Dean, he has a lot of conflicts about how he sees himself after hell that he really struggles with, for example. And then you also have hyperarousal, or your body essentially having a lot of trauma reactions. So think about situations where, let's say someone slams a door or they drop something on the ground. Think about how our body might naturally react to that. But someone who has PTSD, a lot of times they have really big reactions. Their brain and body instantly go into, this is life or death mode. So these are the different kinds of things that come with PTSD. And so I thought it might be nice to talk about, okay, so Dean clearly is in the danger zone for PTSD,
Right.
especially in season 4. So what can he do about it? So I
Okay.
guess, Keaton, one thing I'm curious about is, what do you know or not know about PTSD treatment?
So honestly, I'm not really sure if
Yeah.
I actually know much about PTSD treatment. I always just, I mean, you watch movies and like I feel like
Mhm.
it's not really portrayed accurately in movies because in like movies and TV shows and stuff, it's like they make it seem like it's one of those things where you have to face your fear and then once you do it, you're completely fine and
Mm.
over it and good to go forever and ever. Like that's the way they kind of make it
Mhm.
seem like, oh, now, like, oh, before I was out of the game because this bad thing happened to me and I keep reliving it. And now that I've faced my fears, now I'm indestructible and badass again. Like, that's how I feel like it's portrayed a lot of the times
Yeah.
in movies and TV shows. You know, they always have like the character that has like the nightmares and then they wake up from it and it's like, oh yeah, which is certainly something that's very real when it comes to PTSD. And I
Mhm.
what is the name of the other one that's like more temporary? That is
So
like
acute stress
acute stress
disorder
disorder. That's it.
is essentially a recognition that for some people, in the weeks following a trauma, a traumatic event, some people just struggle more with the reverberation.
Yeah.
So anyone going through that, your brain, your body, it's all having to process through it. And so for some people there's more of a struggle where essentially you're seeing a lot of these symptoms over a lot of people, but some folks are going to have them more intensely and cause more issues. And so it doesn't necessarily mean someone's going to end up getting PTSD, but it's saying, okay, there's something here that we might want to look at and support someone with and see if we can help them through. So, for example, like you and I, okay, we're from North Carolina, you're still living there. We know a lot of people right now who are dealing with some really traumatic, the floods
Because
and
of
the
the hurricane.
hurricane, right?
Right.
So all this stuff that's happened, and so there's all these ways that people are reacting. And so when it comes to these kinds of events, they've looked at, hey, do we try and put everyone through treatment and therapy and have them talk about it right away and see what happens? And so actually that doesn't seem to really be helpful, to say, okay, everybody go talk to somebody. You got to talk to someone because you've been through this thing. Well, it's
Hmm.
not that simple. Not, we can't cookie cutter it.
Right.
But what they have found is if you have acute stress disorder, so essentially PTSD symptoms, but it's just the weeks following,
Okay.
then therapy can be helpful. So therapy can help with just reducing those down, reducing the risk that you end up with longer term issues like PTSD. So PTSD is in the to simplify things a bit, think of acute stress disorder is, okay, right after something happens, if I'm having a lot of struggles with it and I'm needing some support and help, and I'm having a lot of those symptoms that you would see with PTSD, but it's just been like those first few weeks, it hasn't even been a month yet, then that we see that as acute stress disorder. And then after that month or so, okay, things have solidified a bit, we're now in PTSD territory, where we're thinking that the body would have worked through, hopefully, quite a bit of that stuff already. So something's getting stuck.
So, is acute stress disorder, is it one of those things where if something happens, if they get help with it right away, it might not develop into PTSD, but if they don't, a lot of the times it can develop into PTSD. Like, I guess the way I'm thinking about it is like when someone goes through an injury and skips over their physical therapy and ends up with like a lifelong, prolonged injury because of it.
It could be. And I think the important thing to keep in mind with that too, though, is there might be a lot of people, might be, I'm sure there are a lot of people out there who skip their PT and they are fine.
Right.
And there are people who skip the PT and they ended up in a worse place than they would have been had they
Right.
been able to do it. So, yeah, absolutely. And once again, stressing that there's a whole range and continuum. So absolutely certain, just given the numbers out there, there are people listening who have had or currently have acute stress disorder, and some of them might really need support in order to hopefully prevent it getting to PTSD. And there are people listening who have PTSD. I rarely say things with such absolute certainty, but unfortunately there's a lot of trauma out there, and just in terms of the numbers, odds are, based on how many listeners we have, there are people with PTSD also who listen in. And so, by no means do I want to suggest that someone with PTSD either did something wrong
Hmm.
in responding after the trauma happened. Because also, I mean, let's think, when I was saying, when I laughed and said, if people don't do PT, there are people who don't do PT. There are people who don't do therapy. And there's no judgment behind that, because life is hard.
Hmm.
And what's and then, okay, so we have a situation where there's a traumatic event.
Right.
Life's hard enough juggle to fit in therapy when you're not dealing with the fact that you just went through a trauma,
Yeah.
right? So by no means is this like a shame, or if only someone had. No, no, no. People are always doing the very best they can,
Right.
and life is just hard. And so ideally, we make it as easy as possible, and these folks can get support as early as possible. 'Cause for anything, the
Right.
earlier you can help someone, the better. So now let's talk about Dean's options. So when we saw Dean in this episode, he's probably acute stress disorder still, but I mean, let's be real. Like, we've watched the show. His trauma stuff sticks around for a little bit.
Oh yeah. Well, there was literally an episode like after that
Yeah,
where
I love that you kept watching
oh yeah, I
after we
absolutely did.
recorded.
Once I lock yeah, I locked back in because it's one of those so if I'm watching a TV show, there's certain if I've seen it before and I don't mind like falling asleep on it, I'll just have it play. It'll be like my go-to when I'm getting
Yeah,
ready to go to bed. I'll end up hitting 2 or 3 episodes like while I'm just on my phone or whatever or working on a lesson plan. I'll just have it on just because like okay, since I've seen it, that like
yeah,
anxiety isn't there
uh huh,
as much as when I'm like watching a season finale of something I've never seen before. And so, yeah, I just kept it going just because I do love how Supernatural always does that thing where they do a really good job progressing the long term storyline. Like they have the monster of the week with like little sprinkles of what's coming
yes,
up. And they do such a good
yes,
job with it. I'm like, I got to see where this goes because I knew that
yep,
season 4 was going to be the one that ended with Lucifer actually getting free.
yep.
And so I kept watching. But Dean and
There's a
Sam,
lot of self-loathing
there's
going
so
on
much
with
self loathe,
Dean, shame. Yeah,
and he outwardly says, "Hey, we're not going to talk about that. We're going to put it aside, and we're just going to get what we need to get
yep.
done."
And even
Sammy,
when he
like
does
that's
talk
how,
about
like
it,
yeah,
even when he does finally share with Sam, Sam's like, "Okay, let's talk about it more." And he's like, "No."
no,
Be
let's grab a beer.
no. And I mean, what he says is, I guess, technically true in some ways, but he's like, talking about it isn't gonna change that it happened. And so, here I talked about this last, he's so, veteran military combat-esque in
I
a lot
love
of the
him.
things that he goes through.
He's so cool.
I love his character. I would love working with him. He would be great. He would be so stubborn and irritating to work with, but
Oh
oh
yeah.
man, I just he's one of those people that not only could you talk straight with him, but you got to talk straight with him.
Mm,
So, you were talking before about a lot of these things make it seem like you face your fear and then poof, it's gone. And obviously life is not that simple.
right.
At the same time, here's the great news about PTSD treatment is that it's actually really effective. And so, currently, one of my really good friends, she specializes in PTSD treatment, specifically with veterans, actually.
Okay.
And so, when it comes to PTSD, that right now we have three major psychotherapy treatments and medications that tend to be the most recommended things that you can look at. But there are other treatments, other therapies too that are available. But the really big ones are cognitive processing therapy, prolonged exposure, and EMDR. And the really cool thing about all three of these psychotherapies is that when you look at them, over 50% of people, if they're able to complete the treatment, over 50% no longer have PTSD anymore.
Okay.
And that's so keep in mind what I just said, no longer have PTSD. Even add even more people to that if we're talking about the treatment helps them and reduces their symptoms, right? Makes their symptoms more manageable. Over
Hmm.
50% no longer have PTSD. Out of the other ones, there's, a portion who they have improvements even though they might technically still meet criteria for PTSD. So like you
Okay.
could have PTSD and still be going to work, still have relationships, and you're juggling them and it's difficult, but you're doing it versus say the symptoms are getting so bad that you don't leave your house, your relationships are breaking down, you're not able to do your job, right? So there are these different levels of how much it could be impacting you or
Hmm.
how severe or how frequent or how intense the symptoms are.
Right.
You could have nightmares, but you have them a few times a month, or you have them but you're able to go back to sleep, versus they're hitting on you intensely every day and it's something always on your mind, right? So there are all these levels. So these treatments are really effective. Medications, a little bit less so, but still not bad. So the treatments, when we're talking about medications, if you really hit on those medications that work really well, over 40% of people, when they're on the medications, then they no longer meet criteria for PTSD. So they don't have those symptoms hitting that. Remember, I talked about those four. They're no longer having
Hmm.
that group of symptoms. So the treatments actually do work.
Okay.
And you kind of hit the nail on the head that a big part of treatment, or really the key to the psychotherapy treatments, is facing the trauma. And the good news is you have different treatments so you can do it in different ways. And
Hmm.
there's even some other treatments too that aren't these top 3
Yeah.
that they're trying to get more research on them to see if they're as effective. But you have a few different angles you can hit it from, um, which is nice because it's not pleasant to focus on doing a trauma psychotherapy treatment. And so
Hmm.
having some options where you can find the one that's the best fit for you can be really nice. So yeah, the
Okay.
good news is I mean, in some ways, I mean, what you said was like a quick and dirty truth, and I think they way oversimplify it a lot of times on TV and movies and stuff. But essentially, the trauma gets stuck, and then there's avoidance that happens. And what happens when we avoid? It takes less and less for whatever we're avoiding to get triggered for ourselves.
Okay.
And so what can happen is there's this cycle where of course if there's this really terrible traumatic memory that's coming to mind and you're having all these reactions, the natural thing to do is to back away from everything that's causing that. And then
Hmm.
all of those things just get heightened more and more and more. And so an approach to the trauma memories in one way or another can be really helpful.
I guess how would someone know that something that could potentially cause acute stress disorder like happens? Like, how do we know if it's like what's the difference? Like, for example, I mean, we've been talking about Halloween. If somebody has a jump scare, what is the difference between a jump scare that's just something that's temporary and something that could legitimately be acute stress disorder?
So we're talking about sometimes when clinicians talk to each other, they say big T traumas because there are things that can hurt us or harm us and really hit us in ways that can be similar to this, but it's really what we're talking about is the fight or flight response is really triggered. And so we're talking about uh, life or death or really large safety. We're talking about sexual assaults and sexual harassment. We're talking
Okay.
about physical assaults. We're talking about car accidents. The flooding in North Carolina, there's absolutely going to be folks that end up with PTSD from that. So even these natural events, you're more likely to end up with PTSD if you were injured in whatever that situation was,
Mhm.
versus, but there are also people who end up with PTSD from exposure. So, for example, people who are around bodies that have gone through the trauma, so they might not
Mhm.
have gone through it themselves, but if they're seeing the bodies of, say, like from COVID, or once again from natural disasters, or EMS, EMT, people who are doing emergency rescues and things like that. They see a lot of things that other people go through. Also, the more you're exposed to traumatic things, just the more likely that you can end up with PTSD as well.
So with acute stress disorder and PTSD, is it normally something physical that happens then, or because like what you're describing, all of those, it sounds like physical things, like you said, car wrecks, or a soldier that was in war, or injury or
So
something happening. But like, is it so? Like, I guess my question with that is it always something like the trauma that happens? Is it always physical, or is there such thing as like
So
mental?
there's so there's
Yeah.
absolutely mental as well. So verbal abuse, manipulation. One of the things I want to stress too is that your safety can be threatened. Your sense of safety can be threatened without a finger being laid on you. And in some ways, some of that abuse can stick with people for longer,
Mhm.
um, because it's insidious. It can infect, remember, one of the things about PTSD is how you view things, and so when when there's this less physical piece, one, sometimes it's harder to identify,
Mhm.
or you do this unfortunate comparison of yourself to others, and saying, well, surely I shouldn't be dealing with this because that person over there got physically injured, right? And so
Right.
there's all these ways that sometimes that can get stuck. But also, if there's some sort of verbal abuse, or verbal manipulations
Mhm.
that are going on in some way, sometimes those seep in,
Okay.
and it almost creates an internal voice for you, whether it becomes your own voice, or you even might hear the voice of that person or whoever it might be, replaying for you years and years and years
Mhm.
past that time. So it's not per se that a physical injury has occurred. And it could even be that a physical injury almost occurred, or there was a threat of something, or just keeping in mind, unfortunately, we can be very cruel creatures to one another.
Right.
There are ways to threaten people and threaten safety, or to feel threatened, even if someone else wasn't perpetrating it or doing it on purpose, that can reach that level of those that life and death reaction. And then that life and death reaction starts getting hypersensitive, and it's getting triggered by a lot of things, which is why approaching it is helpful to help the brain work through, okay, let me become less sensitive. It's kind
Mhm.
of like, those really annoying fire alarms, those smoke detectors,
Yeah.
like back in college, or
Mhm.
where you just pop popcorn, it's like beep 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 beep.
Yeah.
A person with PTSD has that really annoying smoke detector going off on them,
Mhm.
and they have to learn how to maneuver the smoke detector. And sometimes you can replace the smoke detector in some ways, or switch out the battery, or come up with skills, or maybe sometimes you just know, okay, when I put the popcorn in the microwave, the stupid smoke detector is going to go off, but I know it's not a fire.
Mhm.
And so you do that enough, you can kind of put it in the background, and it doesn't get in the way of popping the.
Okay.
And so, when it comes to one of the interesting things that actually came to mind for me too with Dean is, so you were asking questions about the trauma itself. Sometimes we don't fully know if the trauma happened the way the person remembers it. And actually, our
Oh.
memories are not perfect. But and a lot of times with these treatments, so like cognitive processing therapy, you're working through your beliefs and your feelings, the reactions that you have, from the trauma. and you're actually doing different homework assignments and bringing them in and talking it through. Just, okay, so how did how I feel and think change because of the trauma, and working through that. And then you have, for EMDR, you're doing kind of a similar thing. There's a physical, there's like a movement piece to it that you do. You might watch something with your eyes go back and forth, or you might
Hmm.
tap your hands on both sides, or other things where you have kind of a movement component. But it's also okay for this one. It's thinking of the trauma while also trying to change a negative belief that's getting you stuck because of the trauma, and trying to be able to change how you think even when you're thinking about that trauma. And then prolonged exposure is literally replaying that trauma for yourself over and over again, so that you can just simply get used to it. Kind of like, if you're afraid of spiders, just being around a bunch of spiders for a long time,
Right.
it's gonna get rid of your phobia eventually, because you'll just
True.
get used to them, right?
Right.
So there are these different treatments, and they all work, and different ones work best for different people. Um, in general, no matter what, one of the things that these things can help with is your brain takes things to extremes no matter what. It's not
Right.
always going to be perfect. And so helping you work through that. So there's always disjointed things about the memory of a trauma or some of your reactions to it. You realize, you know what? This doesn't 100% make sense now that I've played it through and I can really look at it more
Hmm.
intently. But then, I mean, also, PTSD doesn't happen in a vacuum. So one of the things that was really interesting to me about Dean,
Right.
and the timing was interesting, I was actually consulting. So, um, there's a link with this episode for the VA, the Veteran Affairs website for PTSD. They have excellent resources, and you don't need to be connected to the VA to find them useful. There's even there's like decision trees to help you figure out which treatment might be a good fit for you. There's recommendations for how you can find providers who specialize in a certain kind of treatment if you'd prefer a specific kind of treatment. So it's not just veterans that can find it useful. Um, they have a consultation that VA providers can use. And I actually reached out to them about some things recently, and it made me think of Dean, because I was asking, okay, so let's talk about our folks who might have schizophrenia or bipolar disorder with psychosis or other things like that. And what do we do if we're not sure if the trauma that they went through that they're describing, what if we're not sure if there might be a component of a delusion happening? What
Okay.
do we do? Now think of Dean, and think of the world he lives in, a
Right.
world in which most people don't believe in monsters.
Right.
If he tries to go get treatment, his trauma's hell, right?
Right. Yes.
Ruh-roh. So,
Okay.
yeah. So the interesting so well, okay. So interesting, and I think a really great hopeful way is they found that these treatments, they work no matter what other noise is going on. So if you have someone, the person I consulted with, it'd be interesting if they worked with Dean, because they might approach him wrong. But they
Right.
said if it's obvious that it's a delusion, if it's obvious that the trauma did not occur in reality, then you want to approach that with your psychosis treatments.
Okay.
And those treatments hit on a lot of your reactions to things anyway. But if there's some semblance of a trauma underlying what the person's describing,
Hmm.
do the trauma treatment and it works. It still works, even if there's all that stuff. And in fact, all those odd stuck beliefs that can happen with psychosis go down because you've helped the person treat the trauma. So the unfortunate thing for Dean is if he walked up to a clinician and he said, I have PTSD because I was in hell for, what was it, 4 months, which felt like 40 years or something like that.
It was 4 months, but it was, yeah, it was 4 months, but it felt like 40 40
Yeah.
years.
Yeah.
Yeah, it was,
So,
yeah. Oof.
hopefully he'd get a clinician who, even if it sounds like on the top, hey, okay, this trauma didn't happen, would still pay attention, because there might actually be a quite traumatic event under it that's like a symbolic layer.
Mhm.
So you might have people who believe they've literally gone to hell and back, like Dean, or there are other things that they believe about a trauma that are kind of mixing with a psychosis. It can actually happen quite often where PTSD in and of itself can have some kind of psychosis y things that happen with it. Like you might hear voices
Okay.
or have these extreme odd beliefs related to things, and working through the trauma can help. So that's honestly something though that not all clinicians know about. And so that's actually something that I think Dean would have a trickier time with, is finding the right fit of person that he could do it with.
Right.
But if not, EMDR might be a good fit for him because he wouldn't have to really talk too much about it. There's a way to do EMDR where you don't really have to talk about the trauma itself with the provider. So he
Mhm.
could just, he's Dean, he could just lie his way in a little bit. And then when he's doing his imagery of the trauma during EMDR, he can imagine what he needs to imagine and just not tell his clinician. So this is why I suspect EMDR might be a good fit for Dean, since
And
hell is not necessarily something his clinician will know what to do with.
what's interesting with Dean is it wasn't when they really dig into it, when you keep watching the episodes, you find out it wasn't the pain that he went through that was the only part that was getting to him. It was the
Mm,
fact that to stop the pain, they're like, hey, if you do some of the
mhm.
torturing and torment, we will stop torturing you.
Yep.
And he actually gave in and did it. And it's that is what was causing
Mhm.
him the most pain, that he was doing that to others. And
Yeah.
I thought that was very, very interesting, because sometimes it's not even what was done to you, it was what you had to do. So like even when people have had to do things in self-defense, or
Mhm.
like even like to keep from something worse from happening, like it all of that stuff can still really really sit on people. And I thought his was interesting because like I said, if you watch it at first you're like, oh, he's just tortured because he was in hell and that's
Yep.
horrible. But then you come to find out it was even deeper layers to that.
Yeah. And that's, I think, one of the most powerful things that I really like to focus on with PTSD as well. And so he really, so many things remind me of there's a variety of different ways a person can get PTSD, and they're all very very real. One of the things that can happen for folks that have done combat is you've come back to a place without war, at least right now,
Hmm.
right? We're in peace times. Has been that way for a while,
Right.
and at least here on our soil. And so finding being able to talk to the people around you can be really hard. And Dean even hits on this in this season where it's like, no one's going to get this. So what's the point? And then he just ends up suffering in silence, and it all builds and builds and builds. And really he needs that release. And so one of the really powerful things that I like to see is so some of the clinicians that work with someone with combat experience, some of them are veterans themselves. A lot of them aren't. And the same can be true for, let's say, sexual assault. Look at the numbers. Just odds are, yeah, a number of those clinicians know that experience. Not
Hmm.
all of them do, right? And so, one of the things I think can be really powerful too about PTSD treatment is it's also a way to be able to connect with someone about something really terrible that can be so isolating in what it is, because it can feel like you're set apart in this separate world from everyone else.
Hmm.
And you get that so well. I agree with you. They do so well with these longer storylines and supernatural, and that's one of the things that really draws me in with Dean in this season is if you pay attention, and it just it's it's so isolating for him, and he's it's like he's still being tortured. He's not in hell anymore, and yet all of these things are still eating away at him.
Mhm.
And so and hey, for the record, not everyone with PTSD necessarily needs one of these treatments per se, but finding some way to get out of that isolation, approach life again, and get the brain back on track and work through the pain and the ways that the brain has been hurt is just so key. So yeah, I love the way that his storyline goes. And it's also, I mean, it's really amazing to see with PTSD treatment what people can do. People put in hard work, unbelievably hard work. It's impressive. And it's one of those things that I do think it helps to find the right provider. So if you're listening and you're like, that stuff did not work, that therapist was terrible, or this person was awful, please just like see what's out there, because finding the right fit, I think, is key.
Thanks for nerding out with us. I'm clinical psychologist Dr. Amelia Brown.
And I'm educator and comic aficionado Keaton Hopkins. Check out my TV and movie reviews on YouTube at Team JVS. Check out our website at bat-therapy.com, our Bat Therapy YouTube channel, and follow us on social media. And don't forget our Patreon page at patreon.com/battherapy. See you next week. Same bat time, same bat channel.